Hi, welcome back. Today we're going to take a dive into the first of the control systems, first of many that we'll see throughout this course. I mentioned early on that control, homeostasis, negative feedback, these are all concepts that are very much part of the core, really, ideas behind physiology. So this will be our first example of seeing such a system in action. And the one we're going to focus on is the control of circulation, but really the control of delivery. So we've been talking about transport and delivery and various aspects of really moving materials in and out of the body itself, in and out of the interstitial space, in and out of the lungs with gases. And so we're really going to focus on that small scale of the circulatory system and how that gets regulated. This will fit into a bigger picture about control of the entire cardiovascular system, but that will have to come later when we know a little more about how the heart works and the kidney work and the lungs work and all those good things. So again, this will focus very specifically on the way blood gets distributed into the various capillary beds, because we've said that capillary beds are where the action is, that's where all the delivery happens and the pickup happens, and of course there are multiple separate capillary beds. So what you see in this picture is a distribution or a set of those beds. Each one of them provides the blood supply for a different organ in the body, not surprisingly. And you see even there's a certain flow rate that under normal conditions we can expect to have in these different organs. Now, of course, this is not static. This is the important part. So as we do things, we exercise, we eat, we sit up, we lie down, the distribution of blood to these different organ systems will change. But in each of these organ systems, there's a capillary bed. And that's what we're really going to focus on, is how the blood supply to those various capillaries actually functions. The one thing I'll also say at the start is there's another concept we haven't talked about explicitly, and it has to do with this idea of tone, this idea that at normal homeostatic conditions, some of our systems will be, let's say, upregulated. So what this means in terms of the vasculature is even when we're at rest, even when we're under control conditions, there's always a bit of a vasoconstriction occurring. So it's not like at rest all our vessels are wide open and the blood just flows freely where it wants to go or where it needs to go. Instead, there's always a certain amount of background vasoconstriction that we call tone. And we'll see that tone appears in other systems. The heart rate, for example, is regulated. There's a constant tone to keep the heart rate slightly slower than it would be if the heart were removed from the body and kept in otherwise physiological conditions. So this is, again, first example of what we'll call physiological tone, and it definitely affects our vasculature. Now, we have certain data we have to explain. That's always the goal. I think in a lot of these systems, we have certain behaviors and we want to figure out why they occur. And so here's a plot showing the response to exercise. It's schematic, of course, but it shows the distribution of blood into different systems, a few of those systems you saw in the previous image. And it shows them at rest. So that's the red bars. And then it shows them during exercise. And you can see there's some fairly dramatic changes. Not surprisingly, of course, the muscles get an enormous increase in blood flow and blood supply during exercise. That shouldn't surprise anyone, really. What might be more surprising is that the total amount of blood flow goes up. So not only are we getting the blood that we have leaving the heart into the muscles, but the overall output of the heart increases. That's something we'll talk about in the context of the heart and its function, but at this point it's enough to notice that. You'll also notice the bar next to the heart shows an increase in flow into that organ. That's providing additional blood, additional nutrients, additional oxygen to the heart so that it can beat more forcefully, more rapidly. And how that occurs, again, we'll come to later. We also notice there's an overall decrease in what sort of collectively we're calling the remainder. That has a lot to do with things like the GI system, very smooth muscle. This is why exercising with food in our stomachs can be kind of unpleasant, because the blood supply to the GI system gets reduced, and so we can't process that food. And that leads to some discomfort, quite honestly. So we have to explain these kind of changes because as with other systems, while this looks very macroscopic, and it certainly is, the regulation is happening at the small scale. And as we've discussed, the blood supply is most easily regulated in those regions where we can adjust the resistance to flow. And we'll come back to that. Here's another quick shot of this same sort of information. The x-axis is oxygen uptake. That's a metric for level of exercise. And we can see all the plots kind of going up in a sense, but that's really the total flow. But the width of those different bands can sometimes stay the same, sometimes go up. Obviously, it goes way up for muscle, but the viscera, that's again the GI system, the smooth muscle in our guts and in our, sort of thoracic and abdominal cavity, they get progressively less and less blood as the exercise load increases. So same data, virtually just another visualization. Now we come to the core idea that we'll see again and again, and that's this idea of control. I mentioned this briefly before. There are certain elements that a control system needs, the same way we need elements to control the temperature in our heating systems in our homes, or the water bath that we use to warm up things in the lab. And those are laid out in this diagram. So we need a sensor. Let's start from the middle here. We need a sensor that tells us what the temperature is, or what the pressure is, or what the flow is, or whatever parameter we're trying to control. And then we need an organ, a system, something, and this can be tricky to picture in a living system. We need something that has kind of a mathematical function almost that compares the measurement from our sensor with a set point. Now, this notion of set point is critical and certainly rather mysterious. The set point in our temperature, our internal temperature, is 37 degrees Celsius. So somewhere there's a part of our body that's measuring our temperature and comparing the output of that measurement to a threshold value or a set point value. And if those two don't agree, then that comparing function delivers a signal. It says one is higher than the other. For example, our set point might be higher than our actual temperature. And that information then goes to a feedback system of some sort. And that system will have some notion of gain. So a small change in the temperature may bring about a relatively larger response of the system in order to restore, and that's the negative feedback part of things, to restore our regulation system, whatever that happens to be, back to its nominal value. So that regulation, that's sort of the actuator. That's the part that does the change. When we're cold, for example, the signal comes that we need to get warmer. So the signal comes increase whatever activity we can to create heat. And that regulation system there would be shivering in the worst case. And that would generate heat. Our muscles contracting in the mode of shivering would generate heat. And of course, the reverse would be true if we're too warm. There we'd have a release of perspiration and a cooling. So again, negative feedback, these elements of a regulation system, a sensor, a comparing function, a set point, and a feedback system. Those we will see again and again. And we'll use those terms again and again as we evaluate different systems that we're going to describe even today. So the overview of the system we can describe also in terms of a goal of the system. So the goal in the circulatory system, as we've just seen, is to adjust the circulation so that blood flow is adequate, whatever adequate means. Now, we've just seen adequate may change as a function of our exercise level or how warm or how cold we are. But there is a notion in the circulatory system of adequate blood flow as defined by the metabolic needs of the tissues of interest. And that can become local, and we'll come to that in a second, because obviously the tissues that need more fuel will differ under certain conditions, and they'll be different for different parts of our body. Our brain needs less fuel than our muscles do, as you can easily imagine. So that's really the goal of this particular functioning system. There's a secondary goal too, which is to maintain adequate pressure and pressure differences, because without those we don't get flow. So if we shut things down so much there's no pressure difference, then we're not going to have any flow at all. And so a certain amount of pressure will also be one of the goals of this control system, which we'll actually talk about in the broader context of pressure regulation in a subsequent lecture. So what are the process steps? So what are the regulation pieces here? So obviously there's a whole chain of them. This is about blood flow. So we can imagine that cardiac output, to start at the most obvious place, will change under the influence of things like exercise, and that's true, and we'll come back to how that happens later. But we're going to focus more on the peripheral circulation, the actual circulation going to the capillaries, because there we have to regulate blood flow, and we can regulate blood flow in the most obvious mechanism you can imagine, and that is the mechanism of changing the radius or the diameter of the vessels. We've described already these resistance vessels, these small arterioles leading into the capillaries. There's a precapillary sphincter in between. We'll show you that in a sec. All those pieces allow regulation of cross-sectional area, which in a very sensitive way changes the resistance of that piece of the vessel. Let's say as radius goes up, the vessel gets larger, then resistance goes down. It's an inverse relationship. We'll come to that. As I mentioned, the key the key structural piece here is this diagram you've seen before that shows the arterioles flowing through the precapillary sphincters into the capillaries. So the arterioles, they're the resistance vessels again, remember, and they have smooth muscle around them. I'll show you a picture of that in just a sec. And the way we affect these changes is by changing the radius, which affects the resistance in a fourth power relationship. That's a lot of sensitivity. That's a lot of kind of gain in our feedback system that we'll make use of. Here's a picture showing this breakdown of the actual structure of the muscular arteries, we call them. That's another place where smooth muscle exists. And then the resistance vessel, the arterioles. Now both of these are wrapped around with smooth muscle. You can see that in the diagram. It's oriented circumferentially. It wraps around. And so when that muscle contracts, the radius will go down. When it relaxes, the radius will go up. And again, remember tone. Throughout the body, there's a constant background tone, so at rest under normal conditions, the vessels are always a little bit constricted compared to their relaxed or residual volume, because there's always a little bit of muscle tone in the smooth muscle. And smooth muscle is its own field of study, but one of the amazing features of smooth muscle is it can maintain tension for ridiculously long amounts of time. It's not like a skeletal muscle where even picking up a small object will eventually tire our skeletal muscles. Smooth muscle is a different type of muscle, very capable of kind of locking in almost to a certain level of tension and creating a desired radius to produce the desired blood flow to provide the necessary nutrients, right? That's the thread. We'll go down again and again. This capillary diagram you'll see here, of course, doesn't have smooth muscle, and that's important to keep in mind. There's no regulation of the area at the capillary level. They're fairly flexible, distensible. There's an endothelial layer, and that can be distorted, easily crushed and held tight. It's easy to restrict capillary flow, but there's no active control there. So that's not where we're going to find kind of the controller part of a feedback mechanism. A bit of background here. We'll come back to these chemicals in their context a little bit later, but it's important going in to recognize that there's lots of ways that the body has to regulate those smooth muscles. There's a lot of chemicals, neurotransmitters, immune system byproducts, even simple ions that can affect the degree of vasoconstriction or vasodilation. So here's some chemicals that we typically think of when we think of vasoconstriction. So norepinephrine is a classic one. But again, norepinephrine, when it's acting upon a certain receptor, this gets all very confusing and we won't dive too deeply into the details. But all these materials, these substances will cause vasoconstriction. Here's a number of chemicals that we know cause vasodilation, so a relaxing of the vessels. So you see there's a lot of kind of knobs to turn, so to speak, a lot of points of regulation that the cardiovascular system can apply. Now there are two types of behaviors, and hence at least two types of systems we have to explain. So these are behaviors. We'll come to the mechanisms that support those behaviors in a second. So these two behaviors, or these three behaviors, all belong under the big category of local control. And this is the surprising part, I think, when you first get exposed to this material, that a great deal of the control of the vasculature at this fine scale happens locally. It's not the brain, It's not the endocrine system. It has a role, and we'll come back to that. But there's a great deal of control that happens locally. And how in the world can that possibly work? So here's one piece of data, one behavior that we have to be able to explain. We have to come up with a mechanism to explain this. This is called autoregulation. To picture what's going on here, start in the middle of this diagram where it says control value. Now the control value is the value at some kind of stable situation, homeostasis, some level of rest or exercise, whatever, but a stable situation. That's where the blood flow is sitting. That's on the y-axis. And then on the x-axis, you see pressure. So that's a stable point. Now picture a sudden, let's say, increase in pressure. So the pressure increases. Now be the pressure pushing blood through that segment of a vessel, of a small vessel, arterial, something with control built in. That pressure goes up initially to that top curve, the black curve, that point on the black curve. Depending on how much pressure increase there is, there's a jump up to the point, the associated point, that black dot on the black curve, which is, I'm calling immediate response. But if we wait for seconds to minutes, then that response reduces. And the blood flow goes back to the level before the increase in pressure. The same is true in reverse if the pressure decreases. Initially, there's a decrease in blood flow, but that decrease is then restored. So that means that when the pressure increases suddenly, for whatever reason, into that segment of vessel, and all other things are the same. This is not a vessel that needs more blood per se, right? It's at a calm homeostatic condition. But if there's for some reason an increase in pressure, you can picture this as when you go from lying down to sitting up, and all of a sudden there's a bunch more pressure into the vessels, the capillaries, near the bottom part of our body, from simple change in hydrostatic pressure. So anyway, this pressure would increase, there'd be an immediate response, and then there'd be another delayed response that would bring the flow back to what it was under the previous conditions. And that's autoregulation. So it's local, and it's maintaining a needed level of blood flow. Here's another bit of data that you sometimes see. This one makes more sense. This one we've kind of seen the macroscopic version of. This is what happens when the rate of metabolism increases and the associated increase in blood flow. This should be no surprise at all. It's kind of interesting in the shape of the curve, the main point here is it's not a nice linear relationship. That's certainly important to note. The exact shape is certainly going to vary from tissue to tissue. Don't get too bound up in those details, but there'll be some upswing or increase in blood flow in response to an increase in metabolism. No surprise. That's called active hyperemia. So hyperemia is increase in blood flow. That's what that means, I think, in Latin. And it's active, as in we increase activity and we increase the blood flow that goes with it. We also have another phenomenon called reactive hyperemia. This is an interesting one. This is not one that we would expect. So in reactive hyperemia, if we occlude the flow, and that's what you see here, you have a flow as a function of time graph. If we picture occluding the flow, so the flow suddenly drops to 0 or some small value, and we hold it there for a while and then let it go, the blood flow doesn't go back to the original value right away. In fact, it overshoots. It goes above that original value and then eventually settles back down to that original value. And again, achieves homeostasis, goes back to whatever state it was in before. This will be, maybe not an obvious one as to how we explain that, but we can. And there are two main hypotheses, and these are hypotheses, which suggests, as they should, that we don't know all the details here yet. But there are two sort of, hypotheses, theories, whatever you want to call them, about how this regulation in the local space might occur. One is called the myogenic hypothesis, and you can see the diagram here. This is the kind of the specific form of that generic diagram that we showed before, where here we have, for example, as the input to this particular feedback loop, which again, will have to have negative feedback. This particular example here is an increase in arterial pressure, which leads to an increase in flow, of course, right? Increase in pressure, increase in flow, assuming resistance doesn't change. That's that basic equation. Then we have, because of that increase in flow, we have arterial distension. So it expands the vessel wall, and because the vessel wall is compliant, and then the response to that stretch is an increase in muscle tone. So this is a little bit like that reflex when somebody, taps your knee and your leg lifts up, right? This is just kind of a reflex that muscles have, that when they get stretched, especially stretched quickly, they respond by shortening. That's a very common response in the body. And we think, in this particular hypothesis, that that's what occurs. So that distension causes a reactive constriction, an increase in tone, constriction of the muscle, which reduces the diameter, which increases the resistance. And of course, when the resistance increases, it has this negative effect on flow, right? So this effect of flow going up initially is counteracted by a change in vessel diameter. And we think that is one mechanism of how, for example, autoregulation might occur, right? That increase in pressure initially leading to an increase in flow, which later returns to the original flow value because the vessel diameter has been reduced through this mechanism of reaction to the stretch. That's myogenic response. Another hypothesis that we have to work with that's based, probably not so surprising, on metabolic needs, metabolic demands. So this is a little bit like the body somehow saying, I'm short of something, or I have too much of something, and feeding that information somehow back to the smooth muscle again, so they can control the flow through that segment of the capillaries or the arterioles. So here we have a different scenario, or a similar input, but a different response. So initial input, increase in our arterial pressure, right? Just like we had before, which causes increase in flow, just like we had before. Now that increase in flow brings more oxygen into the vessel, right? Just more flow, more oxygen coming in. Now that increase in oxygen is sensed somehow and causes a decrease of a vasodilator substance, whatever that might be. This is kind of magic, right? But at this point, but we saw there are lots of chemicals that have vasodilation action. And if this increase in oxygen could reduce the vasodilation and the vasodilator substance, then that could reduce the arterial diameter. When dilation goes down, then constriction can take over, and we can change that tone to reduce the artery diameter. It can also be that the oxygen even acts directly. So oxygen will also act on smooth muscle. And so an increase in oxygen will also tend to cause it to constrict. So again, that's something we have some data to support. And of course, once the artery diameter goes down, the resistance goes up and the flow goes down. So in the end, we have that same sort of system at play that we can also use here to explain why autoregulation occurs, that same behavior we saw before. But this mechanism also gives us a set of steps that we can use to explain other types of response. For example, we can look at the active hyperemia, not the reactive, but the active hyperemia. This is when the rate of metabolism goes up. So in this case, the tissue metabolism goes up, and that generates a need, and there's a release of a vasodilator then. There's a substance again that responds to that increase in metabolic level by dilating. And when things dilate, of course, we get a decrease in resistance, increase in blood flow, and the oxygen supply increases to meet that metabolic demand. Right? So again, the input stress here was not an increase in pressure. The input stress here was an increase in tissue metabolism. But the same metabolic hypothesis we can also use to explain that behavior. Here's another picture that shows how this plays out in the heart. There's more detail than we're going to get into here, but there's evidence to suggest that there are all the necessary substances and sensors, even way down in the capillaries, to pick up on these things like increased metabolic demand or increased need for oxygen and feed back to that system. And all these mechanisms kind of play out in that same vein of thought, that somehow there's a sensor and a response to that sensor. Again, the metabolic hypothesis can respond to reactive. Here's another picture of reactive hyperemia that we can say matches in function the same one we've seen before. Notice here too that the longer duration of the constriction, so the reduction here in the femoral blood flow causes, or pressure because we've occluded it, causes a reduction of flow down to zero, and the response, that overshoot of the flow in the lower graph, that gets bigger and bigger the longer the duration of the occlusion. And again, the metabolic aspect of this can easily explain it, because it will say we've lost our supply of oxygen or nutrients, and the longer we've lost that supply, the more time is needed to rebuild that supply, and so the longer this hyperactive or reactive, hyperemia will occur. So all this kind of fits, at least logically. And we can also see there's again a sequence of events that we can walk through here with increased tissue flow and the metabolic demands that go with it. The mechanisms are tricky. We don't know all the details. So this is an active topic of research still. There are some conditions we have to have for a metabolic feedback mechanism. There's got to be a sensor somewhere that picks up on the lack of whatever, or picks up on the increase in metabolism through some other mechanism. And that information has to feed back upstream, because it's down in the capillaries themselves where the sensing is likely to happen. That's where materials are crossing the boundary, getting to the muscle, and that's where the muscle, let's say, lactate is building up or other changes are occurring. And that information has to feed its way back up to the precapillary sphincter, where control can actually occur. So this makes things all a little kind of tricky and demanding to figure out. But again, we think that this method actually makes sense, or that this mechanism makes sense, and then it explains the behavior that we have. But again, it's complicated, and there's lots of questions still out there. We've talked mostly in this context about short-term regulation. I'll briefly mention long-term regulation. We'll come back to this too, especially in the context of renal function, because it plays a role, a huge role actually, in long-term regulation of vascularization. But in the long term, there are a number of other changes that occur. So when a muscle gets built up, we exercise, and there's more metabolism happening, we get a short-term response, but then over time, we get a longer-term response. We get an increase in vascularization. This is one of the key responses to exercise, is we see an increase in the density of the blood vessels themselves. The ability to deliver those nutrients to the tissues goes up because there's more vascular vessels literally there. There's more surface area to allow that delivery to occur. And there are a lot of factors that can feed into that. Increase in arterial pressure will do that. There's an angiogenesis factor. Angiogenesis is the construction, or literally the genesis of new vasculature. Angio is vasculature or vessel, and genesis, of course, the creation of new vessels. And so there are factors that will change that whole scenario and cause an upregulation. A decrease in oxygen, that we call it hypoxia. That's what occurs when a muscle gets exercised a lot. The oxygen levels are decreased. That can stimulate the long-term growth of vessels. And an increase in metabolic activity, as I've said. So all these four factors, and probably many more, can feed into the net response of an increase in vascularization. And that's long-term, and it's huge. This is a much bigger effect than all these short-term regulations, which is why you can only exercise, one of the reasons, many reasons, you can only exercise for a certain amount when you've been inactive for a while. And only after you build up some conditioning can you exercise for longer and longer, or harder and harder than you could in that initial condition. And part of that response is literally an increase in vascularization. Again, lots of other topics that we could talk about in there, and lots of other research areas. But the key thing to remember is that this long-term regulation is really powerful, more powerful than any of the short-term ones. So now briefly we're going to talk about central control. Obviously it exists, you can anticipate that. It comes from two systems, the nervous system and the endocrine system. We've talked about both of those before too. Here's a little picture of the autonomic nervous system, and you can see it's very simple and straightforward. There's not much going on there, right? It's very, very easy to picture what might be happening here. Of course, the opposite is true. It's a system that innervates huge amounts of our body. It innervates via two separate systems. You've hopefully heard of this before, the sympathetic and the parasympathetic. And they work in opposite directions, as you would expect just by their name. Now, they innervate to different degrees in different organs, so there's a lot of heterogeneity here. And the net result of all this is indeed regulation of blood supply and lots of other things. We know autonomic regulation, not as an intrude, it maintains all sorts of different systems in our body. But one of them it does maintain indeed is the vasculature. Here's another picture that shows the central nervous system control. Again, lots of arrows, lots of bits and pieces here. But at the end of the day, it still comes down to some core ideas. There have to be sensors. There has to be a way to get information from the sensor to some comparator function. There has to be a notion of a set point, and then there has to be an actuator and some system that can implement the changes that the central nervous system decides we need. And we'll come back to some of these later on, but this basic idea is here as it was before. Now, one of the key sensors that we have to monitor, for example, the blood pressure. I said blood pressure is something that we keep track of, and we will spend time talking about that. There are organs, literally sensors, that are in the aortic arch, in the vessel itself. So in the vessel are sensors that can sense certain things. There are sensors of pressure. There are also chemoreceptors. There are sensors of chemical levels. They can sense things like oxygen levels, for example. So these are specialized tissues, little measurement devices that are actually embedded in our vasculature. So here we see evidence of how that feedback might start, what the sensor might be that's feeding into the central regulatory supply. Now, on the activator side, we also have the nervous system reaching our vessels. They reach a number of vessels throughout the body, and they differ from heart to skeletal, different types of muscle. But at the end of the day, they innervate the arteries, they innervate the arterioles, they innervate the venules, so they can provide all sorts of control, either vasoconstriction or vasodilation, depending on the signals that are sent from the brain. So there's a fine level of control that our body has through a centrally mediated system, through the sympathetic parasympathetic steps. Now, that action can be direct, as in through nerves, like you've just seen, but it can be indirect through the production and release of hormones. So there are lots of hormones in the endocrine system that can also affect these different vessels and interact through receptor systems and cause vasoconstriction, vasodilation as the endocrine system regulates it. So again, there are the sensors we've just talked about. There's a way for that information to get from those sensors to the brain, and the brain can act immediately through its nervous system or more gradually through its endocrine system to bring about these changes. Here's a high-level view of kind of this central control. Here you see, again, it's got its complexities. There are a number of inputs. There's a central control that's managing things. The medullary cardiovascular center is the part of the brain where we think this, it's in the medulla, obviously. So we think that part of the system resides there. And then there's this magic notion that I don't think anyone really knows very much about so far, and that's this notion of the arterial set point. So what is the set point of, let's say, blood pressure or oxygen level or whatever else is needed for homeostasis? And a lot of that information is maintained in the brain, and which may be easier to imagine than it sitting somewhere else in our bodies. But the point is that there are also autonomic effectors. So these are the nervous system inputs, and then there are the endocrine receptors, or endocrine actuators, that where the brain secretes endocrine hormone substances that affect our whole system. And again, just to wrap up, here are these chemicals again. All these chemicals, you see some of them are neurotransmitters. Norepinephrine, for example, is a great example. Some of them, these next three, come up in the immune response to tissues, and their response should make some sense. Angiotensin 2 we'll talk about. You may have heard it a little bit in the context of COVID, but it's a substance that plays a big role. It's a hormone that plays a big role when we come back to talk about global blood pressure and the role of the kidney. These kidneys, right? They pop up again and again. So we have a lot of different signaling mechanisms playing out there. And again, the same or even a longer list of substances cause vasodilation. And so you can see there how many knobs we have through these various systems, some acting locally, some acting centrally. And so when everything is functioning well, they're all perfectly in balance and we get all the blood we need. And most of the time that's how it happens. But you can imagine also many points of failure in this system, any one of these systems breaking down. But the good news is that they're all overlapping systems. And that's another general response or general system observation we can make, that rarely in the body is an important homeostatic situation only regulated by a single system. they're overlapping systems which work together to make up for deficiency shortfalls, temporary illnesses, whatever. And so we have backup, which is probably very comforting to know. So with that, I'll end this initial approach, again, keeping in mind that on the one hand, we've talked very generically about the need for these various elements in a regulatory system, how they talk to the different components. There has to be a sensor, has to be a feedback loop with a negative feedback that talks to an actuator, and that actuator has to bring about a change that restores whatever value we care about back to its homeostatic value. And that's the general case we'll see again and again. You saw it today in the case of regulation through the capillaries. Probably a very important one to know about. So hopefully that was a useful introduction. You can start to picture what happens when you exercise or have different body events that need to be responded to appropriately through our physiology in this case. Again, thanks for your attention. Hope this was at least illuminating, maybe even fun, and we'll see you again soon. Bye for now.